All right, y'all, welcome back. This is going to be lecture 10, Chile. Chile is a really interesting state because they've always been pretty successful economically, but they have had these big shifts from democracy to autocracy over time, and they had some pretty violent dictators in their past. So, all right, let's jump right in. Section 2 is on oligarchic politics and the roots of Chilean democracy. Basically, I just want to touch here. They get their independence in 1810, and the major divide in their society is secular versus religious, right? And this really pops up in the mid 1800s as the Enlightenment movement is sort of moving into Latin America and Chile, especially. Section 3 is on the parliamentary republic. So this was from 1891 to 1925. They had a semi-presidential system with a pretty weak president. Unfortunately, this was highly volatile, right? They tell us there was 121 different coalition governments in 33 years, right? So that's almost four governments every single year. That is just unsustainable, right? And so this high volatility was causing some severe problems. In 1925, they signed the Constitution and they institute what's called the Estado de Compromiso. Um, there's basically, under the new Constitution of 1925, they have a really strong presidency because they had just lived through complete chaos in government, right? 120 governments in 30 years is a problem. So they change things. They go to a really strong presidency that has a 6-year term. Um, they have a lot of strong leftist parties sort of emerge during the Great Depression period. And there end up being basically the setup of the Chilean system forever, basically, from then on was the tres tercio. It's the 3/3, right? You have a leftist party that has about a third of the population voting for it. You have a centrist party that has about a third of the population. And you have a right wing party that has about a third of the voters. Um, and so it's always sort of been that way. And there almost always had to be a coalition government between either the left and the right, or excuse me, the left and the center, or the center and the right. Um, and you also get called what's called the Estado de Compromiso, the state of compromise. And I'll just read you this big fat quote because they laid it out pretty well. It says, such a highly divided system held together from the mid 30s until the mid 60s because Chilean party elites struck a tacit bargain known as the Estado de Compromiso. In essence, the Estado de Compromiso emerged as a consensus on the basic outlines of Chile's socioeconomic structure that included the protection of private property and business interests, combined with state-led industrialization and limited welfare state, right? So the right gets a little bit of what they want, and the left gets a little bit of what they want, right? It emerged from the recognition that no one social class had the ability to impose its will on the others, and a de facto agreement of accommodation gradually developed. The right remained in the game as it was assured that fundamental property interests would be protected. The left remained in the game because it was assured that social reform would continue apace with the expansion of the social welfare state, right? So it just kind of came to this nice compromise agreement. Like, we're not going to wildly redistribute wealth. Your property rights will remain intact, but we will have some social reforms and a basic social safety net for the left, and we'll try to build on that over time. So it was a nice kind of compromise, and it lasted for a long time. Um, of course, they also instituted ISI in the 40s under Aguirre Cerda, and it had the consequences that we've seen pretty much. And then the Christian Democratic Party rises in the 60s and replaces the sort of center party. And so now again, you have the left and the center and the right, but now instead of the radicals, which is the center party, I don't know why the hell they call themselves the radicals. Um, Now you have what's called the Christian Democratic Party, who has sort of taken over the radicals' position on the ideological spectrum. And that is going to cause some problems, right? So Section 5 is about dual crises, the end of the coalitional game and the Estado de Compromiso. So the Estado de Compromiso collapses in the 60s and the 70s. And there are a couple reasons for this. The first is that the leftist ideology is growing, right? There's more and more extremist Marxism and socialism all over the world, basically, during the 60s, especially in the late 60s, right? Um, the second is that there's a decline in the support for the right. And this is because of sort of the shift toward the left in the 60s. But it's also because of a couple of things. Urbanization is reducing the number of sort of rural voters that the right is getting. But also, the Christian Democrats in the center are sort of stealing a chunk of the right's piece of voters, right? And so the church is moving left too in South America, as we've talked about with liberation theology. And so everyone is sort of abandoning the right wing politics of Chile. And so this brings about in 1970 the election of Salvador Allende, who is the world's first democratically elected Marxist president, basically. And the world freaks out, especially the US. The US has been running a propaganda campaign against Salvador Allende in Chile for years, basically, under the auspices of the CIA. Um, the CIA was secretly trying to have the Congress of Chile install a different president than Allende, like not like January 6th, right? Don't certify the vote and put in another president who was running who came in second place, right? Um, but the Congress refused. The Chilean Congress refused to do that. And Allende takes office, right? And he immediately moves to nationalize the copper mines, which is almost entirely owned by the United States. He raises minimum wage. He introduces price controls. Unfortunately, inflation kicks in badly. And there are a couple different arguments for this. Like number one is Salvador Allende was just inept. Number two is that there was sort of a trade embargo, and everybody was really pushing for the Salvador Allende regime to fail, so they were pressuring them as much as they could internationally. There's a little bit of argument for all sides, basically. But what happens is in 1973 there's a coup backed by the United States. Allende is surrounded and kills himself in the presidential palace in 1973. The military takes over, right? Um, and basically, this is a tie between the Christian Democrats and the sort of more conservative wing of the Catholic Church. The military basically claims emergency powers, right? We'll be in and out. We're just going to fix things and give it back. But it ended up lasting for 17 years, as these things are wont to do, right? Um, and so there are a few purposes of the military here. Their first and foremost purpose is to root out the leftists, right? Pinochet hates the leftists. Oh, Augusto Pinochet becomes the dictator, you would call it basically. So they want to root out all the leftists in the country. 30,000 people are tortured. 2,200 people that we know of were executed. There's more than 1,250 missing, disappeared people. Tens of thousands lose their jobs because of their politics. Excuse me, parties and unions are outlawed, and more than 100,000 citizens are exiled because of their political party membership. Um, the second job of the military was to consolidate power. So Augusto Pinochet immediately moves to consolidate power. He names himself the dictator. He creates what's called the DINA, the DINA, the National Intelligence Directorate, right? So this is 100% a dictator move. This is what Nazi Germany did with the SS. This is what the KGB and the GRU were in Russia and under the USSR. This is the Communist Party in China. They always have these sort of internally looking forces, making sure that there are not, dissenters. Okay. Um, he also gets pretty nasty, right? Augusto Pinochet does. He assassinates the former general who basically retired before Pinochet becomes the general before he took over the country. His name was General Prats. So General Prats and his wife are exiled, living in exile in Argentina in Buenos Aires, and he has them both assassinated, like killed in the street. And then they blew up the former ambassador to the United States in Washington D.C. with a car bomb, which was absolutely wild, right? So they're getting a lot of international pressure. Like, what the hell is going on? Um, this also leads to what's called the Chicago Boys, right? There are some economists from the local Chilean university system, but they're following this guy called Milton Friedman, right? Milton Friedman was a University of Chicago professor, and so this is sort of what's called the Chicago School of Economics, and they run this basically hyper neoliberal program, right? And they shrink the bureaucracy and they sell off all the state assets. And at first, it leads to like extreme unemployment and a shrinking economy. But things start to correct, right? After about 6 or 7 years, things start to really correct in the late 70s and early 80s. And Chile becomes sort of Latin America's miracle economy. Um, and so in 1980, Pinochet's like, all right, man, things are going really great. I'm going to have a plebiscite. He has a plebiscite on, okay, first of all, are we going to pass the new constitution that I want? Because I'm planning on giving things back in 1989. But, do we want this new constitution and do you want to reelect me? It was like, you have to vote on both at once. And so he won. Um, and he says, all right, I'm going to get ready for another plebiscite in 1988 to decide either whether you're going to keep me again or whether we're going to transition to democracy under this constitution. But he manipulates everything first, right? So before the 1988 plebiscite, he stuffs the entire Senate full of cronies. He stuffed the whole military full of cronies, and then put in the Constitution that the president cannot remove anyone from the military. He stuffed the whole judicial council with cronies. And then they manipulated the election laws to favor the right side of the system, right? So they basically instituted what is called a two-person district with open list party system. So two people come from every district instead of the single member district like the US. And you can only win the second seat if you take more than 65% of the vote, right? And so, like, even if you get 64% and the right gets 36%, which is often what they expected, the right still gets to keep a seat from that district. Um, so it basically guaranteed that the rights would win seats. Okay, let's see. Let's move on to Section 9, the return of democracy and the concertación government. So Pinochet loses the plebiscite in 1988, but he's still like a senator and he's still the leader of the military and he's very, very powerful because he basically handpicked everyone who's running the government. And there become two coalitions in modern Chile, right? The Alianza, which is the right, which is basically the yes vote. We want to keep Pinochet in 1988. And then, so this is going to be the National Renewal Party and the Independent Democratic Union. And then on the other side, on the left, the no vote, like let's have democracy, let's get rid of Pinochet, is the Concertación, right? And this is basically a huge grouping of anyone who doesn't want a dictatorship anymore. So it's the Christian Democrats, the Socialists, the Party for Democracy, the Radicalist Party, the Social Democratic Party, a lot of the church, the women's groups, all sort of got together and defeated Pinochet in the 1988 election. Okay, so in 1990, Patricio Aylwin, I don't know how to say the name, becomes president. Basically has to serve this role as the linchpin between the military on the right and the far left communists, right? Because both sides are really pissed off right now. The military is saying we're going to take over things again. The far left is saying, we need to go much further now that we have power. And so Aylwin is sort of stuck in the middle saying, let's just have compromise and not have a civil war and not have a coup and try to keep things moving, right? And so he basically continues these neoliberal economics. But he boosted a lot of good social spending, like healthcare and education. And these are two of the things that we've learned from the EOI model, the export-oriented industrialization. If you look at Japan, South Korea, China, these kind of countries, a lot of their extra money is going to healthcare and education so that it can have long-term payouts for their economy. Um, and they basically get huge growth and huge reductions in poverty. They also instituted a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, just like South Africa did, to investigate sort of military human rights abuses. But they tended to avoid prosecutions because they did not want the military to step in again. Okay, so in 1994, Eduardo Frei Ruiz Tagle, I'm not sure, becomes president. Um, During his term, Pinochet is getting surgery in London, and Pinochet is arrested, right? The former military leader, the former dictator who had disappeared thousands, tortured thousands. He is arrested at the behest of Spain, the country of Spain, for having tortured Spanish citizens during his reign. Um, there's huge legal battles in Britain about whether they should extradite him to Spain. They decide yes, but then eventually they decide, okay, this guy is way too frail. We're going to send him back to Chile because Chile had promised they were going to prosecute him. He returns, but he is basically just never prosecuted before he dies. Um, yeah, that's about it for this section. Thanks so much for being here. I'll see you for the next one.